So yeah, I mean, this is one thing I think, I really learned this time. I knew this already, I've written about this before, but বাংলাদেশের বাইরে কিন্তু কেউ কিচ্ছু জানে না বাংলাদেশের সম্বন্ধে কিচ্ছু জানে না মানে the most basic facts. Every time I was doing a TV interview, a radio interview, or even a newspaper interview, ওরা সবাই বলতো আচ্ছা আমরা কিছু জানি না, কিন্তু আমাদের অডিয়েন্স কিছু জানে না বাংলাদেশের ইতিহাস বা যে কোনো কিছু 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 জানে যে গার্মেন্টস আছে এবং ক্লাইমেট চেঞ্জের বিষয়টা জানে, বাট more or less, and this is our fault. No one's listening to me. Gen Z, I mean, they're really impressive. I spend quite a lot of time in Bangladesh when I'm in Bangladesh working with early career researchers, young researchers. Earlier this year, I was lucky to visit Dhaka University and Jahangirnagar University and speak to students there. So I meet, and also I'm an advisor to this Youth Policy Forum Bangladesh. I don't know if you know this group. They're a tremendous organization. I did some work with them earlier in the year. They were, I think, very impressively trying to do policy change in an impossible situation under the Sheikh Hasina Awami League regime. So I've met quite a lot of the Gen Z people in the last couple of years, and I was deeply impressed. I would always come away thinking, okay, it's not a great situation in Bangladesh, but I had great hope that change would come. I couldn't anticipate this particular form of change. Although we had seen many student protests before, I didn't, and to be honest, I wouldn't have wished this. The violence was atrocious. It has, in many ways, destroyed the trust of the Bangladeshi people, I think, in the police and maybe the army as well, or at least damaged that trust. And of course damaged the trust in what was for many years the main political party, or one of two main political parties. And that's a real problem, because you can't have a democracy with one political party, or one smaller political party. It just doesn't work. You need an opposition. So it shouldn't have happened like this, but it did happen like this, and it was tremendous. I think the student movement, the anti-discrimination movement, were very thoughtful, very well organized. And I think that they learned a lot from looking around what had been going on, from studying previous movements, previous revolutions. So I think it wasn't an accident that this happened in this way. But the significance of what happened on the 5th of August, I was thinking about this. There's been a lot of people talking about the details and that this happened and that happened and all of that. But I think, if you step back a little bit and look at this historically and structurally, I think we learn a couple of things. I think it's very interesting when you think that we have these, you can say, almost 15-year cycles in Bangladesh. Look at 1954, then 1969, Ayub Khan was toppled. Then after 1975, again in 91, 1990, 91, again, a military regime was toppled, a very long and relatively powerful one. And then in 2006, we had whatever that was. It wasn't a popular uprising so much, but still, power was toppled. And then again in 2024. So what does this tell us? I think it's very interesting. The political sociologists, they say, people like me, we say Bangladesh is a classic case of a weak state in a strong society. And I think that means that governments, they have a desire, they have a wish to control, to dominate, to take more and more power from the people. And they can do that for a while, but at some point it is no longer possible. And it's partly because people get fed up, as you say, people are fearful, people are angry. The costs of repression become very high when you have, Ainaghar and you have disappearances, and people are afraid to say anything. People are being jailed for Facebook posts, for God's sake. Then I think it's clear that you cannot sustain that kind of political domination in Bangladesh over the long term. I always say this to everyone. I used to say this a lot when the Awami League was in power. They thought they could deliver development and growth without democracy, without any kind of accountability. But the Awami League was not the Chinese Communist Party. They wanted to be, but they were not that. They were never that. It's a weak state, even though it became a much stronger state in the Awami League period, but it's still a weak state and the society is relatively strong. So I think there are big lessons here. Maybe if we have a more democratic state in future, it can hold on to power for more than 15 years. We'll see if people have the space. But democracy is hard. Democracy is hard work. One thing I think that we know is that a state must be accountable to its citizens. Otherwise, it can never be really legitimate. People won't respect it. They won't abide by the rules. No, force is a sign of a relatively weak state, I think. Definitely. You know, when you can't get people to agree with you, you can't get people to follow the rules that you are making, that you are setting, then that's a sign of weakness, not of strength. I think many things have to happen, you know, from you know, a kind of clean tax process. You know, people have to know that when they pay their taxes, it's not going into some rich guy's, you know, new house or new palace somewhere. We have to know that the legal process is fair. We have to know, and it's so, you know, I'm saying it's not just about political parties rotating. It's more than that. It's about institutions. It's about people feeling that when they have problems, they can go to their local government, their, you know, municipal government, their ward council, whoever it is, and be heard fairly and get what is their right. People have to have a sense that their rights are respected. All of those things add up to a strong state. But as I say, democracy is hard. It's hard work. Powerful people have to give up some power. Middle-class people have to give up some power also. There are lots of working class people who are not listened to, who don't have any rights, because they are not the ones who are coming to the streets in Dhaka University campuses and other places. Who's listening to them? These are all the things we have to think about in terms of building a strong state. Is a strong state such a great thing? Yes, I think it is, because we need to deal with some really big problems. We have to deal with climate change. We have to deal with, I think you've frozen. We have to deal with a global economic system, which Bangladesh is very vulnerable to. We have to deal with internal issues. We have to deal with an unfriendly neighbor, big unfriendly neighbor. There are many challenges. But I think the strength of the state really comes from, and it's a very hard situation. This is not in many ways like the caretaker government of 2007-8, not like that, because what the Awami League did under Sheikh Hasina is they fused the party and the state. You know, it was the same thing, essentially. It was the Awami League state, essentially, by the end of it. So how do you separate the institutions, the civil, you know, the bureaucracy, the military, the police, the legal system, even civil society and the media? How do you separate it out again? Very, very challenging situation. That said, I think two things. One is that I would like to see, I think it will be helpful for Bangladesh to know what are the principles, what are the rules by which this interim government is going about its job. Now, we know that the constitutional basis is unclear, but nevertheless, we can take principles from that constitution, from our political practice. How should this be? How should this be done? The other thing is the process. Who should be listened to? Who should be in the room when decisions are taken? Not just the students. I think the students would also agree. It should not just be the students. It should be a broad section of society. I keep saying, for instance, that we don't see much sign that labor organizations, trade unions are being involved in these conversations. These people are the backbone of the country. The farmers, where are they? Who's listening to them? How are they being brought into this process? So principles and process, that would be for me a good starting point. Then we can talk about tenure. Then we can talk about work plan. But I think, you know, what is the basis? Bangladesh invests one of the smallest shares of GDP in education in the world. Like many much poorer countries than Bangladesh spend more on education. We spend very little. And actually, there has been a creeping privatization of Bangladesh education. I'm not just talking about the university level, I'm talking also at the basic education level. More and more people are putting their children in kindergarten, what do they call these? KG, cadet schools, all of these private schools, because the government system is just not delivering. So they must invest in the public system, in the public education, because that's where the majority of the children start school, go to school. So spending is one thing. You have to have more money. And the parents or the students or the teachers or the education experts, they just introduced this reform. And I understand now it's been reversed. I'm not sure that that's the best answer. I think we do need a reform. We have to stop doing this, old style memorization of and lots of exams and tests. None of this is good for learning. We do have to think about, what kind of economy do we want? What kind of economy can Bangladesh have? Our only natural resource is our people. I know people don't like to hear it, but it's true. So we have to invest in the people. And if we're going to compete globally, we have to have people whose education levels are much, much higher on average. There's been some great studies. There's a researcher called Niaz Asadullah. You've probably heard of him. Brilliant scholar. He's done fantastic research on education. Among other things, he's shown that many children will leave even class 8 and won't really be able to read and write properly in Bangla, let alone English. Forget English. In Bangla, won't be able to do basic maths. Many, many Bangladeshi students. How will we compete on a global stage? It's impossible. So yes, and on health, we saw after COVID how vulnerable we were. We were lucky with COVID. It was not as bad as it could have been, but we have to invest. We have to protect against mass, crises, public health crises, but also we have to make sure people have access to the health services they really need. People spend a lot of money. Rural people spend a lot of money on health crises that they shouldn't have to spend on, that government should be providing for. Important. But, we have to think also about how do we move up what they say, move up the value chain. RMG still, it's improving, but still we produce pretty basic products compared to, if you look at Vietnam, came to RMG sector 20 years after Bangladesh, maybe, and they've moved up the value chain. They're producing high value products and earning a higher income for it. We're producing low-end products mostly with basically it's basically a cheap labor model of economy. So the first thing is really for us to abandon this cheap labor model of thinking about our economy, start to invest in the skills of workers. And this, of course, what I'm going to say now. This means also that workers must have rights. They must be protected and they must be paid properly. They must have the right to have their wages increase when there is inflation. They shouldn't have to take to the streets and have massive protests every time. All of this is necessary for us to move up the value chain, even within garments. Diversifying beyond garments, again, we need a skilled labor force. There's no substitute for that. And that means investing in education, not just tertiary education, not just vocational skills. It means basic education. Without that, we cannot diversify. I really don't believe we can. But it is possible. Bangladesh has done these things before. We do need to move beyond RMG, but we also need to move up that value chain. At the very minimum, they need to be able to hold free and fair elections and hand over to whoever comes. But most of us don't think that that's enough. Most people don't think that's enough. If I'm listening correctly to what people are saying in Bangladesh, most people think that's not enough. Many people are talking about constitutional reform. That's a big job, I would say. And I would also say that I'm always amazed at Bangladeshis' faith in rules, given that most Bangladeshis I know don't really like to follow rules. And it's not clear to me when we've had previous constitutions that anyone was following those rules anyway. It comes down ultimately to how political power is distributed, I think. And there I think I would judge the interim government as successful if they do succeed in some way in dispersing political power beyond political parties, beyond parliament, and right down into local government and into the hands of citizens, independent of the state structure, so that they can act as a watchdog, as a check and balance on the state. That I think is important. Economically, I think, just getting through this, particularly difficult period we're in would be great. But clearly, there must be massive reforms to prevent the kind of grand corruption that we've had before. We cannot have people going off with 2,000 crore taka bank loans. This cannot happen again. So there must be radical transparency in these sectors, I'd say, particularly the energy and finance sectors. So those are massive reforms as well. All of this is very difficult. It's not clear to me that an interim government of 1 or 2 or 3 years can achieve all of this, but maybe they can put the foundations in place that will make it possible in future. I think it's a lot to ask for an interim government.